In the marble corridors of Alexandria's ancient world, where philosophers grappled to define virtue and mathematicians charted the edges of the known world, a young princess discovered a horrifying truth. Power doesn't necessarily come from wisdom or justice. Sometimes it is forged in fire of having survived the inconceivable. This is not a story of golden empires or wise minds. This is a descent into an even darker legacy, a narrative in which trauma is law, abuse is policy, and a single queen's inner wounds poisoned an entire empire. Arsinoe II was not just a rebellious queen who defied social conventions, she reordered them. She turned incest from a clandestine vice into an institutional norm, and in so doing, she laid the groundwork for the eventual downfall of the Ptolemaic dynasty, one of the ancient world's greatest powers. But how can a woman's individual suffering radiate outward to become royal orthodoxy? To understand that, we must face an uncomfortable fact. Some of history's greatest heroes weren't heroic visionaries. They were broken men whose personal demons left lasting scars on entire civilizations. Arsinoe was born in a world in which daughters were a product and love was a liability. Her family connections were not bonds. They were chains, cinched and slackened at the whims of political necessity. In this grim world of betrayal and trickery, she didn't just survive. She fortified herself with her wounds. Her own life had been a Greek tragedy, written not in poetry, but in desire and blood. In the tale of this, the victim never rests. She becomes the oppressor, the architect of a regime that necessitated other people to suffer as she had. And what was so disturbing about her legacy was not so much what she did, but how meticulously she had done it. These weren't crimes of passion. There was no madness in her eyes. Arsinoe possessed a cold, calculating exactness, building a dynasty wherein incest, manipulation, and murder were not taboo, but rather instruments of state. What she built would echo for generations. Each new monarch or queen in her dynasty pushed the boundaries of decadence further, as if securing their allegiance not to the people, but to her blueprint. The Ptolemaic dynasty started with Ptolemy I, Alexander the Great's cunning and able general. It ended with Cleopatra VII, women whose memory is made up of seduction, drama, and empire-wrecking destruction. And although the name Cleopatra still inspires intrigue, the seeds of her ultimate failure were sown centuries earlier by Arsinoe II. She instilled her successors with a deadly lesson. In the game of power, nothing is off limits. But in order to truly comprehend her power, we have to return to the beginning, not to a throne, but to childhood, which would have assassinated most. It was around 316 BCE. The Mediterranean was exploding. Alexander the Great had just passed away, and his empire was in pieces, fragmented by his greedy generals, the Diadochi. Among them was Ptolemy I Soter, who captured Egypt and declared himself pharaoh in the newly built city of Alexandria. He created a hybrid court, Greek in culture, Egyptian in ritual. Statues of Athena stood side by side with statues of Isis. Scrolls of Aristotle were read beneath lotus-engraved ceilings. But don't be fooled by appearances. Underneath this gaudy blending was a government upheld by violence and fear. The Ptolemies were not indigenous rulers, outside conquerors, and they embraced Egyptian customs not out of respect, but to secure their grip. One such custom would be both their strongest point and their ultimate downfall: royal incest. In this world, royal women were not people. They were pawns. Marriage was not about love, it was about strategy. Daughters could be married, imprisoned, or even killed, depending on how useful or threatening they were to the throne. And since daughters held royal blood, they were a constant threat. Marrying them off was risking your rivals gaining legitimacy. So what was the answer? Keep them close, very close. It is into this fatal court that Arsinoe is born, child of Ptolemy I and his queen, Berenice. She grows up with a world of silent poisonings, public killings, and whispered rumors behind closed doors. A palace where ambition had no limits, and security was a privilege few like her could ever afford. Above all, though, the darkness behind closed doors wounds her the most. Ancient texts speak carefully, too carefully, about Ptolemy III's excessive affection for his daughters. The words used are delicate. The truth they hide is not. And from these unspoken horrors, Arsinoe would forge an identity as cold as marble, and just as unbreakable. There are no open confessions on the record, no surviving testimony of what Arsinoe endured. Such things were rarely documented, and least of all in courts of law. But history whispers in patterns, in cryptic suggestions and fading shadows. And if we follow those patterns, through rumor preserved by successive writers and the ghastly explicitness of her own actions, a picture emerges, unmistakable and very shocking. Plutarch suggests unforgivable transgressions within the Ptolemaic dynasty. Strabo discusses customs so vile that so-called barbarians would be shocked. These old chroniclers, centuries apart, had read court records now lost to the ages. But their warnings remain, and what they suggest is ominous. Just 15, Arsinoe was married not to a man of her own class, but to Lysimachus, a man 4.5 times as old as she. One of her father's battle-hardened generals, he was old enough to have been her grandfather. What could have been an escape from the sinister darkness of her father's household was instead an enslavement. Lysimachus was no hero. Cruel and paranoid, he governed his court with suspicion and brutality. Arsinoe was caught between two monstrous men, one who had destroyed her innocence and another who used her like a receptacle only to produce heirs. But here, in the harsh gaze of a paranoid king, Arsinoe learned her most important lesson. Morality was a luxury for the powerful, and even they applied it seldom. She saw how her husband had his own son executed on suspicion of treason. She saw how lives were ruined by rumor and envy, and in the stillness of her survival, something inside her shifted. Slowly, she lost her innocence. In its place, she began constructing a new identity. The process from victim to master manipulator was not sudden, gradual, incremental, and agonizingly painful. Each effort at self-defense came at a cost. But with each compromise, Arsinoe grew stronger. At 20, she was a silent force in the court, engaging informers, brokering clandestine affiliations, and practicing the art of silence behind the royal smile. She bore him 3 sons. For a brief moment, she may have known security. In a world still racked by wars of Alexander's broken empire, however, peace was always an illusion. In 281 BCE, when Lysimachus died in battle, the position of Arsinoe shifted once more. Queen to bereaved political plaything. Young mother of royal princes was both prize to be won and threat to be eliminated. And here we see the full development of the strategist Arsinoe would become. Rather than beg for safeguard or be remarried against her will, she acted. By a brilliant stroke of diplomacy and guile, she preserved the lives of her sons by sending them to her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus. who had just seized the Macedonian throne. But then came an action so phenomenal it shook the ancient world. She married him, her own brother. Even during an era when royal incest was the norm, this was a shocking action to the Hellenistic courts. Why? Because it wasn't something done out of tradition. It was an instrumental union, one created for use as leverage. Cyrannus was mad, violent, and unpredictable, but Arsinoe believed she could handle him. She was wrong. Shortly after the wedding, Cyrannus had her 2 elder sons executed in front of her. He claimed they were threats to his throne. The horror of that moment is hard to put into words, but what ancient historians relate next is horrifying. Arsinoe didn't weep. She didn't shriek. She was suicidally stoic. She had been taught years and years ago that weakness was a death warrant, and that mourning was an indulgence. Her escape from Cyrannus's court is the finale set piece of a revenge play. Disguised, hunted, and priced out, she escaped across a hostile landscape, assisted by nothing more than the subterranean networks she had established over years. And with every obstacle, her ruthlessness sharpened. She bribed, she blackmailed, and some accuse her of contracting murders to clear her path. What she lacked in armies, she possessed in sheer will and an ethical compass long since shattered. When she eventually arrived in Alexandria, she found a city altered and a throne just recently seized. Her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, was now pharaoh. Their reunion would alter the fabric of Egyptian history. Ptolemy II was already married to Arsinoe I. The marriage had yielded no male heirs and was for both of them a misery. Seizing her opportunity, Arsinoe II played for emotional chords. She used all, flattery, politics, and their shared trauma to tug at her brother's heartstrings. Before long, she'd convinced him not only to abandon his queen, but to wed her herself. It was even by Ptolemaic standards a scandal. But the actual shock was not necessarily the incest, but the calculating, masterful mind behind it. Incest had been a long-standing practice in Egypt. Pharaohs had done it for thousands of years, enveloping it in sacred tradition. But what stunned the ancient world was not the deed itself, but Arsinoe's audacity. She did not simply receive her brother's hand passively. She arranged the marriage, staging the concoction of treason charges against his former wife, Arsinoe to prepare the way. And when she was queen, she did not sit by the throne passively. She took it, as co-regnant. Coins of the period sported their double portraits, side by side, equal in size, equal in force. Both names appeared on official documents. She took the title Philadelphus, brother-lover, and wore it as buckler and broadsword against detractors. But Arsinoe's ambition went much further than symbolic power. She overhauled Egypt's tax system to generate maximum royal income. She remilitarized the military, concentrating loyalty to the throne as never before, and in arguably her most fateful action, she legalized incest as official policy, not a custom, but an obligation on every Ptolemaic king after her. It was no longer a private vice. It was royal policy. The reasoning was twofold. Theologically, the Ptolemies were divine, like the gods of Egypt had once been, and of Egyptian gods' pantheon, divine siblings wedded, Isis and Osiris most notably. By emulating the gods, they cemented their own divinity. Politically, marriage between siblings maintained the throne in royal family control. No foreign prince could wed into the family and take it over. Only family could reign. But Arsinoe did more than that. She created a cult around their relationship. Temples were ordered to include prayers to the sibling gods. Entire festivals were created to celebrate their wedding. Poems, statues, and frescoes of their romance were commissioned and spread across the nation. It was propaganda of the most potent sort. The ugly sanctified, the forbidden consecrated fate. And in the short term, it succeeded. The Ptolemaic dynasty consolidated its grip. Enemies were eliminated. The kingdom stabilized. Alexandria was the glittering jewel of the Mediterranean, a seat of knowledge. The famous Library of Alexandria was enlarged. Trade thrived. The arts thrived. But under that glittering veneer, the roots of the empire were decaying in silence. The incest policy, when capped by the dynasty's obsession to eliminate threats from within, created a breeding ground for disaster, genetic and psychological. Generation after generation, the Ptolemies married close to close, and the result was tragic. Early dynasts like Ptolemy III, son of Arsinoe II, and Ptolemy II were reasonably stable. But what followed was a persistent, distorted decline. Ptolemy IV was famous for cruelty and debauchery. Ptolemy VIII grew grotesquely obese and couldn't even get out of bed, paranoid to the point of murdering his own son. By the time Cleopatra VII came to power, the line had been depleted by madness and rot. Modern genetic studies of Ptolemaic mummies have confirmed what contemporaries guessed. The dynasty suffered from extensive inbreeding, hemophilia, club feet, scoliosis, reduced fertility, all the warning signs of an imploding gene pool on itself. Even the legendary beauty of Cleopatra was at least as much legend as fact. Surviving coins which date from her reign feature a woman with well-marked, harsh features, possibly the result of generations of physical damage. But the physical harm was only half the damage. The psychological harm ran even deeper. Picture growing up in a palace where your brother might be your bride or your executioner, where dinner with the family was a diplomatic minefield, where fear was essential and trust a risk. Kids who grew up that way learned young that staying alive was a suspect option, family was sanctuary and war zone. And paranoia became then the dynasty's legacy, passed from parent to child in addition to crowns and titles. More twisted with each passing generation, each king more broken, each kingdom shorter and bloodier still. Arsinoe's legacy wasn't restricted to her relations. It infected all that it came into contact with. Her policy of institutionalized incest didn't just transform the royal line, it changed Egyptian society altogether. The Ptolemaic court was now a hothouse of sadism and vice, where human emotions were distorted into instruments of oppression. Love, trust, and family were no longer inviolate. They were commodities to be used. Courtiers imitated the royals. Abuse became mainstream. Morality was mocked as weakness. And slowly, a cancer invaded the administration, devouring the very foundations of governance. While Egypt's institutions withered away under the corruption, it grew increasingly vulnerable. Vulnerable to corruption, vulnerable to instability, and ultimately vulnerable to Rome. Even religion, formerly the foundation of Egyptian cohesion, was twisted to justify royal behavior. The priests, economically dependent on the Ptolemies, were forced to defend rituals they inwardly despised. Incestuous cults, the purview of mythology, were now policy. There was a crisis of religion. The religious authority of Egyptian tradition collapsed, leaving the people more open to foreign ideas, among them Christianity. which would go on to spread like wildfire. But perhaps the most corrosive aspect of the reign of Arsinoe was this. Her legacy was a cycle of abuse, institutionalized. Contemporary psychology acknowledges this syndrome. Victims of childhood sexual trauma struggle with boundaries. Many, far too many, repeat the cycle of abuse in adulthood. Arsinoe's transformation, victim to architect of incestuous monarchy, was trauma on a grand scale, and still, she was a genius. Documents from her reign, edicts, epistles, and commissioned poetry bear witness to a mind of breathtaking brilliance. She was a 9-language speaker who spoke with philosophers and possessed a subtle grasp of politics, economics, and military organization. She might well have been remembered as one of the greatest queens in all history in another universe. She is remembered in our universe as the woman who converted trauma into tyranny. One letter, written late in her life to a young female relative, offers a chilling glimpse into her mind. In it, she teaches the girl the ways of surviving palace life, warning, "Love and trust are luxuries we cannot afford. Even family, especially family, must be managed carefully." It's only one sentence, but it encapsulates an entire philosophy of life. A life built on betrayal. A woman who no longer believed in the things that make us human. In later life, Arsinoe was in growing isolation. Her brother-husband, Ptolemy II, grew more and more reliant upon her even as their marriage disintegrated. Court chroniclers wrote of their rare public appearances as chilly, remote, tainted by underlying tension. Others even went as far as to believe that she was poisoning him gradually. We shall never know the truth. When she passed away in 270 BCE, she was deified under the same religious system she had remade. Temples were erected in her name. Priests sang hymns extolling her as the ideal queen. But there were also those who did not accept this sacred myth. Graffiti scrawled across Alexandria's city walls had a different story to tell. Hasty drawings and mocking scribbles. Citizens questioning whether the gods actually sanctioned a sister wife as goddess. Upon her death, her policies survived. Her son, Ptolemy III, tried to push through moderate reforms, but the dynasty was on a trajectory. Incest, paranoia, assassination. Each king succeeding to not just a crown, but a curse. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a prison of its own making. By the time Rome set its eyes on Egypt, the dynasty was hollow. Decades of civil war and intermarriage had drained its strength. Cleopatra VII, Arsinoe's final contribution to the world, had to turn to foreign sympathizers for rescue. Her ill-fated affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not romantic games. They were a lifeline for a dying empire. In 30 BCE, when Cleopatra took her own life and Roman standards dipped over Egypt, the dynasty of Arsinoe collapsed. But the damage had been done. Egypt, the magnificent ancient cradle of civilization, the birthplace of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and architectural wonders, had been turned into a cautionary tale. A tale of how power, released from ethics, can be reshaped by suffering into a machinery of cruelty. And at the heart of that story is one of both brilliance and terror. Modern historians are still trying to figure out how to value Arsinoe II, a product of her time, a traumatized child who never had a hope? Or was she a brilliant diplomat who twisted the world to her trauma? She was victim and artist, hurt and lethal. She didn't break, she shifted, and in doing it, she broke a dynasty and a nation with her. Some modern historians attempt to see Arsinoe II not as a monster, but as a woman presented with impossible choices in a vile patriarchal cosmos. They hold that the options available to her were slim, that her audacity, intelligence, and ruthless agency were all the more impressive for being carried out by someone living in an era where women had so little power. There is value in that reading, but focusing too much on her determination can minimize the stunning damage she did, not just to herself or her house, but to subsequent generations of women and citizens. Her is not a story of survival only, but of institutional damage inflicted in cold calculation. Other authors have offered another reading, Arsinoe, as a psychological case study, a model of the way unchecked individual trauma can spread outward until it reconstitutes entire societies. From this perspective, Arsinoe's reign is a stark cautionary tale, that when the traumatized achieve power and do not heal themselves, they will tend to build the world in the image of their suffering. Her psychological profile is disturbing. She demonstrated symptoms characteristic of severe early abuse, emotional unavailability, distorted perception of intimacy, difficulties with forming genuine relationships, and a perspective all about power and manipulation. But in contrast to most who function in denial or on whim, Arsinoe appears to have been thoroughly aware of what she was doing. She rationalized, she plotted, she institutionalized, ensuring that her trauma would outlive her, and that identification makes her record more, not less, troubling. The echoes of her decisions continue to resonate. Modern regimes based on personality cults, which accept brutality and disassemble morality, have a tendency to repeat themselves in most disturbingly familiar patterns. The techniques shift, but the same dynamic is at work, using the power of the state to dramatize personal trauma on a national scale. Now that we talk more openly about generational trauma, Arsinoe's life is a case study in why abuse is not just passed down through families, but institutions. The Ptolemaic dynasty is no longer just a failed royal family. It's a case study on how one woman's unresolved trauma left a legacy of inherited pain. Her story demands uncomfortable questions. Can we hold someone responsible completely for doing the same things they endured? How do we stop victims from becoming perpetrators? And what does this reveal about human nature? That suffering, unresolved, can be redirected against us into something far, far worse? Arsinoe began as a child, innocent, gifted, vulnerable. But the court she was born into consumed innocence. It made her a survivor, a queen, and finally into the founder of a dynasty that would rot from within. The same intelligence, strategic brilliance, and flexibility that could have caused her to be a beacon of leadership were instead used constructing one of the most toxic legacies in ancient history. The ruins of Alexandria still stand today, majestic but hollow, silent witnesses to the empire she helped shape. Tourists wander through them unaware that beneath the marble columns and ancient stone lies the footprint of a psychological tragedy that unfolded over centuries. Arsinoe II's story is not just history. It is a mirror, a reminder. That trauma does not vanish on its own. That hurt, unchecked, becomes systems, policy, fate, and that even the most hardcore survivors can be the architects of destruction when they build from a place of unhealed pain. The Ptolemaic dynasty collapsed not because of Roman ambition. It collapsed because it was already in decline, a decline from within, poisoned by the legacy of its greatest queen. And as we close this dark page of history, we are left with one final eerie truth. Arsinoe II got everything she wanted. She lived. She ascended to power. She reshaped the world in her own image, and she ensured that her legacy, her policies, her systems, her agony would echo long after her death. By her own measure, she succeeded. That her victory had come at the cost of an empire, of so many lives, and of her own family, may not have mattered to her. For the lesson that she'd learned as a child was one that she never forgot. To live, you have to sacrifice everything, even the future.